Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's History at Home. It's a little different format this time because we are not quite sure why, but we had some technical difficulties with Helen's presentation, and so we had to re-record. So we are re-recording this now without an audience, but we did want to bring you the program because we know it was really enjoyed by a lot of people, and Helen's done a tremendous amount of research on it, and it really is a great program. So I hope you enjoy it. Before I cut to Helen on this, though, I do want to remind you that we do these programs free of charge. And if you could see it in your heart to send a donation our way, we always accept it. You can do it by Venmo. Just look for Montclair History Center and my name will pop up. We now accept Zelle. You can send us a check to 108 Orange Road, Montclair, New Jersey, 07042. Or you can go on our website and just click join or donate. If you do that, if you could just in the little section there, put down that it's the History at Home that's triggered your donation, because that's important to us. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Helen Fallon, who is a member of our board and a researcher extraordinaire who is just a joy to listen to. And I think you'll really enjoy her presentation tonight on Montclair Heights, which is her old stomping ground, or her own stomping grounds. So Helen, why don't you get ready to share your presentation and we'll be on our way.
Thanks, Jane. I'm happy to do this. Third time's a charm. So what we're going to do in this show is we're going to spend most of our time near Montclair's northwestern corner, from the Little Falls and Cedar Grove border over to Valley Road, and roughly from Montclair State down to Mountain Avenue train station in the Laurel Place area. And there's a few tangents along the way to get the bigger picture of Montclair's history. And just keep in mind that this presentation really sort of covers the period of our most rapid growth and change from the late 1700s to the 1930s. To help get us situated, here's a map of our long, skinny town of Montclair with some key cross streets in there. And south of Watchman Avenue was referred to as Cranetown. North of Watchman Avenue was Speertown. And the area we're going to talk about is way up here in the corner, Montclair Heights, near Hebron Road. This is the map that sort of got me interested in the neighborhood history. It was one of the reasons. So friends gave me this map, and my house is about right here. So, and you can see, just to orient yourself on this map, where you see this pinch, Upper Mountain Avenue and the train coming together, that's Laurel Place. So that always helps me know where I am when I see this pinch. So as I mentioned, this map really got me interested. I could look at it all day long and see new things. And I also met people who grew up in the neighborhood and had been here for generations with their family. And I was intrigued by their stories of what it was like growing up in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And I was also active at Bradford Elementary School, where my children attended, and I knew about their local history field trips. I was active in the PTA and knew how expensive field trips could be. And I thought that these two ideas, my interest in history and field trips, could come together, and that why wouldn't every school have a walking field trip that was absolutely free to take the kids on? So I started working on this. Unfortunately, I didn't finish it until my own kids were like in junior high, but I did present a mini version of this to the third grade at Bradford Elementary with a teacher that I had known. I did a number of years there. But so I'm going to put in two quick plugs here. We'd love someone to sponsor the Montclair History Center to develop walking field trips around every elementary school in Montclair. It could be a turnkey kind of thing. We prepare it and hand it over to the school, and then they could do it on their own every year. But it does take some research and time, and it would be great. We'd love to have somebody sponsor that. The other thing is, if you love maps like I love maps, we have this 1906 map without this yellow line down the middle. We have very high quality, high resolution reproductions of the 1906 map and several other years, different sizes, different looks, different price points, and they can be personalized with your address. This one is not, but look on our website. That's something you might enjoy. So I also need to tell you about, I wanted to just finish this section by introducing you to Jim, who is my neighbor, he is the one whose stories most inspired my research. And he told me all about exploring the neighborhood with Tim and, you know, all the places they went. And of course, Tim is the Airedale, the dog. And Tim even followed him to Bradford school every morning, waited for him to come out for lunch. They walked home together. And I know, and it's been confirmed for me, that on rainy and wintry days, Tim, the Airedale dog, was allowed to wait in the foyer. But the principal said that was okay. Let's just do a little quick Montclair History 101. Most of you probably know this, but of course the Native American Lenni Lenape traveled through this area. We don't have evidence of any great settlements in Montclair. Then in the late 1600s, the British arrived at the foot of the mountain. That's where we are, at the foot of the mountain. The British were expanding out from their settlement in today's Newark, and in fact, we were considered part of Newark for hundreds of years. And the Cranes were the first to build in the area around the Orange Road Myrtle intersection, and that's why the area became known as Cranetown. At around the same time, Dutch settlers were expanding from Bergen and Passaic counties southward, and the Speers were one of numerous Dutch families who settled in what is today's Upper Montclair, Cedar Grove, Little Falls area, and they lent their name to the northern part of town. And then geographically speaking, we live on the eastern slope of a real mountain, First Mountain. It's the easternmost of three long ridges that are 400 to 500 feet high and comprise the Watchman Mountains. So the mountain location gives us the beautiful views, the prime real estate, great bird watching. There's also multiple quarries along the top of this ridge. It also contributes to fresh air and a healthful environment. That's something that was cited over and over again when I read books, accounts of people coming here in the 1800s. It's why they put tuberculosis hospitals on top of the mountains. This mountaintop location was also an important military lookout for George Washington during the Revolutionary War. He was in Montclair, said to be in Montclair briefly, but certainly all along the ridge. And even in World War II, the mountaintop is said to have had a defense purpose. So now let's shoot up to the neighborhood and meet the Speers. This is the oldest surviving Speer house in the area. It's at 612 Upper Mountain Avenue, which is actually in Little Falls now, but a lot of the farmland was in what is now Upper Montclair. The exact date of the construction is unknown. The National Register plaque says 1788, but the owners there now think that it was actually, some portions of the house were probably built much earlier than that. And I was lucky enough to tour the house, and it's really neat inside. Now, this picture that I have here on the left is from the 1850s when it was actually a tavern, and on the right is a more current picture. But, and this is a story I didn't tell the third graders when I did this presentation to them, but one of an old timer in Montclair told me that she had heard that there was a house of, shall we say, ill repute on Upper Mountain Avenue opposite the Speer house at some point. And sure enough, in one of the city directories, I did see massage listed as the type of business at a home in the area that she described. So take that for what you will. And they, like I said, this house is on the National Register. Now, when I visited the house, I saw nails like this, which are rose nails. They're hand hammered. They are from a time before the machine age. I also saw rafters that still had bark on them, and they had beautiful wide plank oak floors. The homeowners also kept a jar on the kitchen counter that filled with artifacts that they'd found on the property over the years. The Speers, like many in the neighborhood, had a farm, and this is not the Speers farm. This was a picture of a cow and a boy from Hillside Dairy off Alexander. But the Speers operated a farm, and our mountainside location gave good drainage, and by all accounts, they did fine. This is just a neat photo I found of Peter Speer and some others. I think it said that it was, they had been hunting. Peter Speers in the hat and the beard and the pipe. And this photo was across the street from his house at 612 Upper Mountain. The dark dog that's curled up here in front, that's his name was Old Snipe. I like that. He doesn't sound like a super friendly dog, but I thought that was cool that his name was recorded. In the block of Upper Mountain Avenue between Normal and Mount Hebron, there's 5 other quite old Speer houses. So on the uphill, they were like the only things on the block for some time. They show up on the 1906 map. But on the uphill side, it's 564, 566, and 570. And on the downhill side, it's 569 and 567. One of my friends lives in one of these downhill houses, and I've been in there, and there's some lovely stained glass windows. And also, when they were renovating, they found some of their woodwork had the name Speer stamped into it. Another important Speer house in the neighborhood is this one at 848 Valley Road near the corner of Normal, referred to as the Van Reyper-Band house or just the Bond house. We will talk about this house a couple times during the presentation. This was built in 1872 on land given as a dowry by Peter Speer to his daughter Carolyn Speer when she married Thomas Van Reyper. It was probably the fanciest thing around, much different than any other dwellings in the neighborhood. Carolyn Speer and Thomas Van Reyper's family occupied the house until 1952 when George and Bertha Bond purchased it. We will talk about the Bonds again later. So then Carolyn Speer and her husband Thomas Van Reyper decided to deed a portion of their farm in front of their home to the Mount Hebron Cemetery, which was organized in 1863. And so you see their house high up there on the hill, and what you see in the foreground is the office of the cemetery. Now, Lisa Ann Renner and I do a walking tour of Mount Hebron Cemetery. When we can all stand close together again, we'll do a tour. And there are some notables buried there. Clary Anderson, who was a very winning coach for Montclair High and Montclair State College. Shirley Booth, who was Hazel on the TV show. Herman Hupfeld, who wrote As Time Goes By for the movie Casablanca. And Alan Dumont, who created the first commercial TV set with his improvements to the cathode ray tube. There's actually many inventors buried there, and there's lots of interesting things in the cemetery, the design of it itself, the landscaping, other people who may not be famous but who have interesting stories, just the artistry of the tombstones themselves. So we may turn it into a history at home, or hopefully soon enough we can be out walking around together again. Another key building in the neighborhood is this former Montclair Heights Reformed Church, which is at the corner of Mount Hebron Road and Valley. It was dedicated in 1901. So Carolyn Speer and Thomas Van Reyper again entered the scene, and they requested that they requested of the cemetery that they put aside the corner of Valley Road and Mount Hebron for a church building. Because if they had to take their horse and buggy, everyone up here had to take their horse and buggy over to the closest Reformed church, which was on Bellevue near the entrance to Brookdale. And, that was a long way to go on a cold winter day. And I guess the Dutch population up here was reaching a critical mass where they could warrant their own congregation. So this was designed by Alfred Simpson, a British architect, and his name will come up again. I wanted to just read to you the message on the postcard. It says, "Mama and I attended the dedication services of this church some years ago. It's within walking distance of our home." It was, so I just thought that was super neat that a former neighbor of mine sent this postcard. And so then it found its way back, and now I have it in my collection, because I too am within walking distance of this church. Now, interesting, those are not stained glass windows that you see. They wouldn't have photographed that way. There's some decorative treatment on the windows. The church couldn't afford stained glass windows until 1959. This is a great photo of the building under construction in the time of horse and buggy. I just can't imagine. And if you've seen that church, it's got, big stone base. I can only assume that those huge boulders that they used in the building were from one of the local quarries. I can't imagine why they would have traveled any further to get them. Now I want to take a step back and take a look at a major development impacting other areas of Montclair, or as we were known in the 1800s, West Bloomfield. So a big development, here we go. The railroads arrived in Montclair in 1856 and would prove to be a most significant event, triggering Montclair to develop into a suburb that we recognize today. So on the left is one of the earliest train stations that is in where Lackawanna Plaza now is, on Bloomfield Avenue, at Lackawanna Plaza near Grove Street. So when this train line was introduced, one could travel from West Bloomfield, which is what we were called, to Newark, switch to the Hoboken train, and in Hoboken catch the New York City ferry. And it took about 1 hour and 20 minutes, we're told. People for the first time could actually commute daily to and from the city from West Bloomfield, today's Montclair. So this is a picture of another train station that was built on that location. It's a little bit fancier. And then what you see now is the station that we would recognize today. This final station was completed in 1913 when the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad terminal debuted to much acclaim. It was like a holiday when they opened this up. And here it is today. Much of it very recognizable. This site, of course, is being redeveloped now. So Cranetown, that area around the train station, with the impetus of the train coming, and this whole area around Bloomfield Avenue, which we today refer to as Montclair Center, was becoming a real commercial center. It was really bustling. This is a picture of Bloomfield Avenue looking east, and here we would be going down South Fullerton. This is a building that's still there, the Crane Building, and Jane and I love this clock. It doesn't have the digits 1 through 12. It has the letters that spell out Seymour Crane, who owned the Crane Building. It was a store, so he was quite inventive. So meanwhile, all this business is happening down at Montclair Center, but meanwhile, the Dutch farmers are just farming away. So how did we officially become named Montclair in 1860? Well, 4 years after the train service was introduced to West Bloomfield, influential residents convinced the post office and the railway that we should have our own name. We had our own identity and we deserved a distinctive name. So they held a contest and Eagleton won. But wait, why aren't we named Eagleton? Because some very influential people thought that Montclair would be a better name. So Montclair was a new winner. And for those Parks and Rec fans, Eagleton is the name of the town where the snooty residents live. So now the first train line I just told you about ended miles from the Dutch farmers, but our area would experience the same transformative building boom when a second train line arrived and established service from Walnut Street to Normal Avenue. So this second train line, 17 years after the first train line, it's completely separate train line, was introduced and was completed, and it had 5 stations in Montclair. On the left, you see the Upper Montclair Station in 1890, the photos from 1890. And on the right, of course, you see what we have today. But on the left, it's essentially a shack. And also note that there's just a single track, whereas today, we have the westbound and the eastbound. So it was just a single track back when it was originally started. And there's a huge history to the trains in Montclair. I do an entirely separate presentation on it that I'm going to be doing in the spring of 2021. And, it started, the train line changed hands several times and had some different iterations. So we can get into that in detail. But anyways, when the second train line was introduced, now we had stations at Walnut, Watchung, Mountain Avenue, and Montclair Heights. Interestingly, this second train line was the reason we became our own township. We had gotten a separate name years before, but we were still part of Bloomfield technically. But we were desperate for the second train line. Bloomfield didn't want to have anything to do with the cost of it. So we petitioned the state to form our own municipality so that we could incur the cost, get the loans or whatever to introduce this second train line. And that's when we became our own township, independent township. So this second train line, there's just a fun old train. Development followed the train all the way up to the north ends of town, just as development had come to Montclair Center when the first train line was introduced. So our population exploded from 5,100 residents in 1880 to over 42,000 residents in 1930, and that's more residents than we have today. More than 20 miles of new road were built in a 5-year span between 1889 and 1894. Upper Montclair farmers were also now beginning to sell to developers like the British settlers in Cranetown had done before them. This is an ad from the city directory. It's for a neighborhood near the Watchman station, but it's very typical of the type of ad you would see. These realty companies owned large swaths of land all throughout Upper Montclair. This particular one I like because they call Montclair New York's most charming suburb. And I'm sure they called a few other towns that too when they were advertising in those town city directories. Here's a picture of some early suburbanites, or otherwise known as some people who moved here from Brooklyn. In this photo, we have Janet Moore and her children, Thomas and Margaret, and they really represent typical newcomers. They live on Park Street. The father, Henry, was an insurance executive who commuted into the city, and they're catching the train at Upper Montclair, maybe to go shopping, lunch with grandma or dad, or go to a museum. And here's a reminder of why they moved out here in the first place. Because New York City could be a really congested and stinky place in the early 1900s, and people wanted to get away from that. Montclair's fresh air and open spaces were a welcome change to people who moved here in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but possibly still today. But as it is often described, Montclair is half country, half city. You have the beauty of the country and the accessibility and vibrancy of the city. As Colonel Frederick Harris said in 1876, these railways have completely changed the character of our town from a sparsely settled agricultural region to a community of elegant suburban homes. So that, the train just had a massive impact. Now let's go back up to our neighborhood and get specific about some things in our neighborhood of Montclair Heights and see how it had changed over time, especially with the addition of the train. So Bradford School was originally called Montclair Heights School. On the left, you see essentially a very large two-room schoolhouse. And if you look on the right, you can see, I know the maps are a little hard to see, but you can see it's got a very small footprint. Here's Mount Hebron Road, here's Valley Road. There's very little, there's hardly any buildings around. All this land is owned by Thomas Brainerd. Smith Street, we'll get into that, is now College Avenue, but you can see the tiny footprint of the school. And I could not love this photo more if I tried, of the kids sitting on the front steps of the school. But the school would be renamed Bradford Elementary School. This is how we see it today. It was rebuilt in 1925-26 when the town's population was booming, and it has had several additions since then. We had neighborhood schools when this was built. So if you lived in the neighborhood, you attended Bradford. It's now a K-5 elementary school with an enrollment of approximately 500 students. So who is Mr. Bradford? Dr. Amory Howe Bradford was a pastor and an influencer. He came to Montclair in 1870 to be the founding pastor of the First Congregational Church, and he preached there for 41 years. His congregants were among some of the most wealthy in this town and the nation, and he was very effective in directing their charitable inclinations. Montclair was only a small village in 1870, surrounded by farms, but it was starting to grow rapidly as a residential suburb of New York. So he saw the opportunity to help build a model community. From the public library to Mountainside Hospital to the YMCA to the annual Bach Festival he organized, to the Montclair Children's Home for Poor Children that he founded, to the Village Improvement Association he helped form, which planted trees and beautified the town in many other ways. He was a moving force. Now, Bradford Avenue is actually named for his father, Benjamin Bradford, who was a minister at a Cedar Grove church. A couple of pictures from Bradford. The one on the left says 6th grade, so at one point it did go up to 6th grade. And now I'm going to dive into the 1906 atlas because, like I said before, you can look at this all day and find something new. So we're gonna take a look at a few interesting things. So, all right, so here's 5th Avenue. That is actually now called Normal Avenue. They named it that because the Normal School property, this is Montclair State. When it first started, it was called the Normal School. That's what teaching schools were called. So then they changed this to Normal Avenue. Let's see. Now these little stars are all homes owned by the Speers. So you see there's not a lot going on, but there are a lot of homes owned by Speers. Carolyn and Thomas Van Riper live here on Lookout Hill. The Montclair Heights station is on the westbound side. It's an actual station. Now there's a tiny little hut over here. And you can see all these train lines. It's not just two, there's these sidings. And that's why in this block between Mount Hebron and Normal, it's very wide on either side of the tracks still. Now, interestingly, in a very earlier map, there's something called the Montclair Heights Depot, which is much closer down here. I think that's when one of the other earlier train lines owned it. Let's see, Smith Street here is now College Avenue, and Carlisle Road is here but has no name. Here's Mount Hebron Road, and this is we're going to talk about this home later. Just notice where it is, and you can, like I mentioned before, so here's the elementary school, and there's all this empty land owned by Thomas Brainerd. So let's go. Now we're going to go to just another section of that map. So here's Mount Hebron Road again, and now we're going further south. The city of Newark owns these two little pieces of land just like they do today, because this is where their pipeline from the Cedar Grove Reservoir travels through town. Just, you know, so it's been there. The reservoir was built in right around in like 1903, 1905. So it had just shown up on this map. This is Mountainside, was owned by someone, William H. Power, all this land, which would become Mountainside. And here's that pinch I told you about where the train and Upper Mountain come together. There's that pinch. Oh, and Upper Mountain Avenue was called Little Falls Road, or sometimes the Road to Little Falls. There's lots of other neat stuff over here I'm not even talking about. So let's look at some of the oldest houses. This one here at 558 Highland, which is on the corner of Highland or Fifth Avenue, or here's Highland and Fifth Avenue, Normal Avenue. So I was contacted by some residents from Highland Avenue. They've been doing some history of this neighborhood, and so I look forward to learning more from them. But this house shows up on a map as early as 1878. Of course, here it's the 1906 map. Here's the Montclair Heights station. As I mentioned, it was a real station. It's a big station. It looks like it's even bigger than what we would see today at Watchman Avenue. It was decommissioned in 1959 and demolished in the 1960s. One of the reasons for a station at Montclair Heights was to serve the state normal school. It was not just a train station, it also had a post office. After it was decommissioned, it was rented for a while by a law firm before it was demolished. And I think I mentioned that there's two Nancys that I got a lot of information from about this neighborhood. And Nancy Knertzer told me, she grew up in this neighborhood her whole life. She told me that she used to go down to the post office as a teenager in the 1930s to buy stamps. The postman was a very sweet man, and he ended up marrying a Highland Avenue girl. Lynn Daviette and her sister, who grew up on College Avenue, used to go down with a nickel to buy candy from the vending machine. Here's some picture from the 1933 of a train chugging through. This is like the 1950s, train coming through, no gates, drives me crazy. And then from the 60s, you can see this is an Erie train. So some good train pictures for train fans. Another very old home in the neighborhood is here at 100 Mount Hebron Road. 96 Mount Hebron Road. Now my other Nancy contact, Nancy Taggart Duval, grew up in 96 Mount Hebron Road. She was born in 1922, and she remembers that there weren't, so here's her house, and she remembers that walking to Valley Road, there weren't that many houses. It really was just this one, and the path was pretty much undeveloped. It was woodsy with wild violets growing. 81 Mount Hebron Road is, you're right, not on the map yet. It would be built the following year, but I wanted to point out this home because it's the manse that was for the minister of the church that is right across the street. 1 Nassau Road, which is now a light blue color, is a very old house in the neighborhood. This picture on the right, it shows it, it was built before 1850, and there's been many modifications, but you can still see how it's the same house. On the right, you can see the Force family sitting outside there. So Siglers and Force, these are some of the other Dutch names in Speertown. and they owned a lot of property in this area. Now, Dan Hurley, who lived on Nassau Road, did a big history into their neighborhood. He learned that this house had an apple orchard that covered the entire block. You can get a sense for how much land they own. So here's the house, and they owned a lot of land. And it was up until a few years ago, there were still scraggly little apple trees that remained. And he also heard a story of a longtime resident whose mother used to take the Valley Road trolley. So here's the trolley line up. Here's the trolley that ran up Valley Road. They would take the trolley up here and get off and have a picnic by Wigwam Brook, which is here. It's pretty much dried up. But, you know, that's, you can just imagine what it looked like with the trees and the creek and jumping off the trolley. Here's Mountain Avenue Station. In 1935, Chet Bolsky, a train employee, remodeled half the building into a 5-room duplex apartment for his family of 5. He and his wife both worked for the train, but they lived there until around 1986. They were very well known, so they maintained the waiting room, and they, you know, they somehow managed to live in a very small apartment above. Here's a great postcard showing some people waiting for the train in 1905. Now, a few years ago, the township was doing some work in the building, so I flashed my Montclair History Center business card as if I was on official business and talked my way into the building to see the non-public parts of the building. On the left is just an office space. On the right is, well, this is the waiting room that anyone will be able to access again once we're through the pandemic and the waiting room is open again. But if you look very close at the seats, you can see the Erie Railroad monogram. I also went upstairs, and God bless them for making it a comfortable home for a family of 5. It was, you know, it was kind of an oddly cut up little space, but obviously they made it work for many years. And over the years, I've accumulated some neighborhood lore, and so I will share some of those tidbits with you. Well, first of all, I read a book called All the Way Down to Bellevue Avenue by Nancy Stevenson Adams, who grew up in one of those little dead-end streets south of Laurel, between like Mountain Avenue Station and Kings, that dead end into Mountainside Park. And she said this quote: "The 3 or 4 block area we lived in could have had a sealed dome over it, and I doubt we would have known the difference, because everything you needed was there. You would have had your commercial district, your school, your church. You know, you would have been able to walk to whatever you needed, and whatever you couldn't get that way was delivered to your door. Going all the way down to Bellevue Avenue was a big deal, to take the trolley and go all the way down there." And as I used to tell the 3rd graders when I did this tour with them, this idea of a 3 or 4 block area being your total circle of existence, that would have been down at the south end, at Watchman, Frog Hollow. Every neighborhood was pretty self-sufficient, and people necessarily didn't have to travel very far. So here were the neighborhood shops for Montclair Heights. They're the ones that were at Laurel Place and Valley. Kyle's, of course, is no longer here on the corner. This picture is a little bit old, but Kyle's Pharmacy, there's another pharmacy now. But here's a picture of Kyle's from the 1930s that Stuart Kyle generously lent me. So he said his father opened the pharmacy in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, this northern part of Valley Road was really the hinterland where the rents were more reasonable. It was practically the end of the line, literally, on the trolley. There were 5 businesses in the shopping district: the pharmacy, a shoemaker, a greengrocer. I think it was, the name of it was Royal Grocers. Mr. DeRogatis was the proprietor. There was also a deli and a tailor. Now, the shoemaker was kind of well known, and a lot of people who grew up in the neighborhood also have a certain kind of memory of the shoemaker. So he made special orthotics for people with foot problems. And apparently he made a pair of shoes for a UN delegate from Africa. And after that, every once in a while, you would see a limousine pulling up in front of the store, because people would come from far and wide to, you know, take advantage of this man's specialty. But as the younger people in the neighborhood sort of remember a different aspect of that, these foot ailments and casts would be in the window, like these castings for these special shoes were in the windows, and people remember them being actually like a little scary if you were a young kid. But obviously the shoemaker was very good at what he did. Victor Marchiavata was another merchant's name. And Mr. Kyle told me to, pointed out to me, they were all ethnic. These were men who would not have been in positions in the white shoe or waspy industries like banking or insurance. They were making their living with these commercial ventures here in the neighborhood. Oh, and a lot of people remember that Kyle's had a soda fountain until the 1950s. And actually, there were lots of pharmacies in town, and many of them had soda fountains. That was a pretty common thing. This is a railroad watchman shack at Laurel Place. They had these watchman shacks pretty much at every grade crossing. There definitely was one at Mount Hebron. There was one at Walnut, one at Lorraine, Pine Street. I mean, so they were all over. The only reason why this one was photographed likely is because this man, John DeRosa, had a magnificent garden. So thank goodness that he did. So he is with his stop sign. He would stop the traffic before gates existed, and then at first the gates were manual, so he would operate the gates. But these railroad watchmen were well known to the neighborhoods in which they worked, because the school kids would see him on their way to school, on their way back from lunch, on their way back to school, on their way home from school. And so they would help the kids cross the street. So they were very well known. And there's a lot of fun stories I've heard from people throughout town about the railroad watchmen who lived near them or worked near them. Now, I heard for many years about snips and pieces about a tea house and other businesses on Carlisle Road. And I thought that was kind of unlikely, but the anecdotes were so definitive and detailed. So I kept looking, and lo and behold, I think I found them. The 1934 Sanborn Fire Insurance map shows 3 shops here, and in the 1943 tax map is hand-drawn 3 small commercial buildings. But the clincher was that I also found a permit in the planning department for the demolition of those stores some years later. And so what people recall is, well, there was definitely a tea house. It was called the Mad Hatter, run by Ms. Morse. Nancy Taggart got a party there when she was 11. And she said the woman was lovely. There was a fencing store that taught, fencing. And other people remember the tea house. And Lynn Daviat told me that there were a lot of little sort of under the radar businesses that might not have shown up in a city directory or something like that. But there was a preschool at 41 College. 8 College Avenue had been a ballet school. And so there were these little businesses all over town. I noticed on the 1926 map something very interesting. I noticed all these streets that between College and Carlisle, here's Mount Hebron, that all these streets on the map that don't actually exist. Like this is Dartmouth and there's Cornell. And of course, today, the only ones that exist are Amherst and Hamilton. And if you're seeing a pattern here, they are all the names of colleges. So at one point, I don't know why they wanted to chop the street up even more, but it never came to be. It's just a little quirky thing I saw. Now, I have pointed out 111 Mount Hebron Road to you on the map before. Let me show you. So this is just a great before and now picture of the house. It was one of the earliest in the neighborhood. Here it is on the map. You can see, yeah, there's like hardly anything around. Here's all those other Speer houses that were around in the tiny little Montclair Heights school. But okay, so if you look real close, which you can't, this says Simpson and Speer, R period, E period. So I asked my neighbor who lives there, do you know what that's all about? And, he wasn't really sure. And, whatever, it was just a little mystery. And so this neighbor, he always painted his house himself whenever it needed to be painted, until a few years ago when he got a professional in and, they really sanded it all the way down to the wood. And look what they found. They found Simpson and Speer real estate. So this was, in fact, Simpson and Speer-Related was a commercial business that is now a house. And if you'll remember, Simpson was the architect who, Alfred Simpson was the architect who designed the Montclair Heights Reformed Church. So it's all in the neighborhood there. We also have a kit house in our midst up here, 542 Upper Mountain. It was constructed in 1922. Kit houses, you can see the advertisement for it from Sears here on the left, the Puritan. Kit houses were designed by quality, reputable architects. They used quality materials. So they offered people variety, low cost, easy construction. The typical Sears house was shipped by rail and could fit in 2 boxcars and came with all the instructions. So check your floor joists to see if they're numbered. If they're numbered, maybe you have a kit house. Check your fixtures. If they have the letters SR for Sears Roebuck, maybe you live in a kit house. Check your windows. If you see the name Norwood Manufacturing of Illinois, maybe you live in a Sears home. And there's a website you can check. And people have said that there were other pockets throughout town where there were some kit houses. Then the people who lived in this house, when they were renovating, they found the numbered, they found the numbers on the back of the steps. So that's how they were constructed. That's how they know. Back to the Van Reyper-Band house that I told you we'd revisit. So remember, Carolyn Speer and her husband, Thomas Van Reyper, built it in 1872. Okay, then they lived there till 1952 when George and Bertha Bond purchased it. George and Bertha Bond lived on College Avenue, just down the street, and they moved on up. And then the Bonds left this house to Montclair State. It's now the home of, I think, the drama costume department or something like that. So, but the Bonds, this was their house on College Avenue. They were well known for their ice cream. It was actually Bertha Bond who started making and selling ice cream. And she was smart enough to set up shop right here at this location right here is at the end of Carlisle Road. And here's the parking lot for the train station. So she could catch the commuters and the students. They had owned a dairy, I guess, the Bonds, before they moved to Montclair. And so they knew a thing or two about making ice cream. And this is outside the neighborhood, but they really went from that little shack to owning this, a whole little chain of Bonds ice cream restaurants. And this one is on Valley Road, where Bank of America is now. It's south of Upper Montclair, south of Bellevue Avenue. And people just, remember this big milkshake, the Awful. If you drink 3, you got a free one. You can still get the Awful at the Newport Creamery in Connecticut and Rhode Island, I think. And the story Nancy Knertzer told me that seems really great is she remembered that when the store was boarded up and they were getting ready to demolish it, somebody scrawled, "Goodbye, old friend," on the boarded up windows. And so a lot of people have very fond memories of it. It wasn't known to be a very integrated place. So some people didn't feel welcome there. People of color didn't feel welcome there. And probably, there were other places in town. But so this, like many other establishments, has sort of mixed memories. But a lot of people do talk about Bonds and the Awful. If you go to the town scoop in Verona, one of their grandfathers, somebody had one of the Bonds franchises, and they still have some memorabilia there, like an old menu and things like that. And they actually have pretty good ice cream there. Here's a fun Bonds, a tiny little Bonds truck going in a parade. To me, this looks like it could be College Avenue. Let's talk about the park and the garden up here in our neighborhood. So here in our sleepy little neighborhood, we got it all going on. We got a park and a garden. Here's the Walther house at 474 Upper Mountain Avenue. It was built in 1858. Of course, now it's the headquarters for the Presby Memorial Iris Gardens. But this is quite a lovely house. It's got Second Empire elements, this distinctive mansard roof. It's got a slate roof. So in 1918, Frederick Walther and his wife Barbara Speer moved into this house, and Barbara would be instrumental, some would say relentless, in having. So here's their house. she was relentless in pursuing the town to get this land designated as a municipal park, Montclair Mountainside Park. So her reasoning was that she wanted to preserve the last stretch of tree-covered mountain slopes and wide fields that form the western edge of town, to preserve a vista that those living and visiting the area in the 18th and 19th centuries, when it was a farming community, would have seen. So it was not an easy sell. The commissioners really made her jump through a lot of hoops to get a lot of signatures in a certain amount of time. And anyways, she did. And I guess we're very thankful that she did. Even before it was officially a park, people played in the open area. But here's a picture from when showing the kids ice skating. The area that's now the pool was kind of a low-lying area, and it would collect water, but also then they would flood it on purpose. And so when it froze, kids could skate there. I heard from multiple people that somebody's dad would drive their car onto the frozen field and shine the light so people could skate at night. And then of course, in the late 60s, this was the location for one of 3 town pools. Of course, there's sledding across the street on Mountainside down the hill. And again, to the book that Nancy Stevenson Adams wrote, she said, "I suspect that Mountainside Park today would be either covered with houses or an annex to the city dump if it weren't for," and she doesn't use the name Mrs. Walther, but it's clear that she was talking about Mrs. Walther, who was really the driving force and was quite a force to be reckoned with from all accounts. And here is Barbara Walther in her later years, and this is a good segue showing her working in the irises, because she would become integrally involved in the iris gardens, which actually came after the formation of Mountainside Park. Her dedication to the iris gardens was notable, and people remember seeing her out there in her wheelchair. So let's see. What I'm talking about are the Presby Memorial Iris Gardens, and they are a world-renowned repository of hybrid iris. There's over 6,000 varieties, 50,000 blooms that form the rainbow on the hill. They have a genetic database there on irises that is unparalleled. The house and the gardens are on the National Register. Essex County now owns the land where the iris gardens are, and they actually maintain a webcam for the gardens on their site. Now, it was Mrs. Walther who had the idea to raise the beds and cut back the foliage in November to improve drainage and to improve the health of the plants as they overwintered. So she actually had a lot of contributions to the iris gardens. But why are they named Presby? Well, who is Frank Presby? He is Frank Presby was a prominent citizen and collector of fine things, active in many civic and gardening related activities. He was a director of the Montclair Art Museum and a founding director of the American Iris Society at the New York Botanical Gardens. He was, in fact, the treasurer of that society when he died in 1924. He was very interested in irises. He had hybridized several of his own. He died suddenly in 1924 of acute indigestion. And his fellow board members at the Montclair Art Museum suggested that an iris garden be planted in Montclair in his memory. The mayor was reluctant to do so because several years prior, Frank Presby himself had donated a large collection of lilac varieties from all around the world to Nishwing Park. And they didn't really have a good setup or good supervision. And so they didn't really thrive or survive well, although there are still some lilacs down in Nishwing from what I understand. But so the mayor was willing to entertain the idea of an iris garden if somebody was there to take care of it. So remember, the park was designated in 1921. The iris garden came much later in 1927. But in any case, the mayor asked Barbara Walther, who was, by the way, a trained horticulturalist, to head the committee for the iris garden. She declined. Her specialty was trees, not flowers. Then he asked her husband, who did accept, and he knew it would fall to Barbara to head up the committee to take care of the gardens. And how did they get these irises? Well, they begged and borrowed. Citizens were asked to divide and share the irises from their own yards. Hundreds of people showed up at a dedication meeting on a hot June day in 1927 to share their irises. Of course, the Presby's children donated plants from their own home at 95 Upper Mountain Avenue. The Van Vlecks donated iris. The landscape architect John Wister, who was a friend of the Walthers and who designed the Rainbow on the Hill, was able to get donations from European growers, including the Florentina from the 1500s. They're a pale blue, very pretty iris, and also the servicemen who were returning from World War I brought iris back from Europe. So that's how they were all donated at that time. They didn't buy any. Now I want to talk about the Capron bench, which is comes up. People ask us about it when they come upon the Capron bench, which is, let me get you oriented if you don't know where it is. Here's the Iris Garden house. Here's the Iris Gardens. Here's the sled hill. So Upper Mountain Avenue. Here's Highland Avenue. So if you walk through the Iris Gardens to the back of the house and up this very steep hill on your way to Mills Reservation, you would come to this bench, which was dedicated in 1956 to honor Charles Alexander, or Lex, Capron. He sat on the Montclair Planning Board for 10 years, was very involved in community affairs, and was, by all accounts, beloved by many friends. After he died in February 1955, a committee was formed to determine a way to honor his legacy, and they designed this stone bench. The caption reads, or the inscription reads, "This place has been built by the friends of Charles Alexander Capron to commemorate the great talents, the unflagging energy, and the generous spirit he brought to a life of service." He sounds like a really great guy. This was a beautiful spot. There was the bench, it had landscaping. This was not far from his own home on Bradford Avenue. But over the years, we also hear that there were some pretty wild hijinks at this location over the years. And I know Lisanne Renner and I would love if a Eagle Scout or somebody would take on a project of restoring this bench. It's pretty neat. Oh, and there I am we're sitting there while I give a walking tour of the area. Now let's talk about Mills Reservation. It was started, it was made possible through the donation of 118 acres of land from the Devella Mills Foundation in 1954. Devella Mills was named for David and Ella Mills. Ultimately, the Mills Reservation has grown to 150 acres. I also do a whole other presentation on Mills Reservation, which you can see on our YouTube channel with many more details. But David Mills made his fortune with this little spark plug that he sold to them. And so they were a very philanthropic couple. They donated money to many causes in Montclair, in Cedar Grove, actually in Canada, where he was from, and around the world. Before Mills was the park, it was actually just wood. People owned various plots, and with money from the Devella Mills Foundation, Essex County Parks was able to buy up those various plots. So it was just a land, trees, azaleas, wildflowers, brooks. It was a great place to watch the fireworks, one of my neighbors told me. And according to Nancy Knertzer, her father had been involved in meetings when they were deciding, should this park be a formal landscape park like Brookdale or left as a natural woodland? And I think many of us are really glad that it was left in this natural state. But you would be amazed at some of the earlier designs by the Olmsted design firm, some of the early possibilities for this area, which included picnic areas, playgrounds, ball fields, lookouts, huge parking lots. And what is the cement pad that's there overlooking the quarry site? Long story short, it was likely and originally a water tower platform because they needed steam power for the quarry below. And it was likely repurposed during World War II as a place to hold a high-powered defense searchlight, possibly radar and other defense equipment. We're still researching that. But anyways, I have an entire presentation on Mills. You might want to check that out if you're interested. And I mentioned the quarries, the quarries all along the ridge of the mountain. The mountain was mined for trap rock, which is the building trade name for basalt, a very tough iron-rich igneous rock, and brownstone, which is sandstone, a sedimentary rock. So, and if you grew up in this neighborhood, you definitely knew that there was a quarry when it was, actually this quarry stopped operating around 1918, but further north on the site of what's today the northern reaches of Montclair State, there were other quarries, and you definitely felt it when they blasted. But so this is, if you were in Mills, you would be standing up here overlooking this site, which was the quarry site. And so this was the Osborne and Marcellus Quarry, which was operated from 1890 to 1918. Some neat pictures. This was the crusher, which turned the tough basalt into gravel. There's a great picture of the guys at the quarry site. This is their mascot. This is their yard that was off of Bellevue Avenue behind the Bellevue Theater. So they had their own train sidings. You know, they would have coal, lumber, gravel, all kinds of building materials. And so we had this in Upper Montclair. There was another similar yard another company had near Walnut Depot, and also, of course, Lackawanna Plaza. So, you know, every part of town had one of these kinds of yards. And I just wanted to mention that as late as the early 70s, there were houses in our neighborhood that kept horses. On Highland Avenue, I heard a lot of stories about Pinney's Farm, which is, you know, so here's Normal Avenue, and this is Highland. So actually Pinney's Farm was on Normal Avenue, but they're also on Highland Avenue near Seneca Place. There was, they remember a horse that actually used to get out a lot or something. On Laurel, across from the Mountain Avenue station, and Alan Dumont, who had a home on Bradford Way, he also kept horses. Of course, all those areas are close to Mills, and you could ride your horse in Mills. Now, Montclair State. It started in 1908 as a 2-year program for elementary and secondary education. It was called the normal school. As I mentioned, that was from a French term for teacher schools. It was a normative school. That's how they got the name normal. But so it would become finally in 1994 a university with well over 18,000 students today. Well, move over Passaic County. I guess the Essex County line was actually bumped north to accommodate the campus. So it used to be a straight line right here, but as it is today, it's bumped out to accommodate the first buildings of the normal school. I am not sure why they went to all this trouble. I guess they just really didn't want it to be called Little Falls University. Why is it so much of it in this California mission style of architecture? The answer is quite simple. Edward Russ, who was the chair of the state's Board of Education, had been to California and admired the Spanish mission architecture there and suggested it to the architect who was charged with building this campus. So voila, that's what we have here. And many in the neighborhood, but also from far and wide, attended College High in Moorhead Hall. It was a demonstration school from 1929 to 1973 for grades 7 through 12. It was very prestigious to get in. Many neighbors went there, and one of my neighbors in particular attended in the final years when it was pretty wild, apparently. But that was a quite a distinction, and they just finished a large addition to this building. This is the amphitheater on campus that was a WPA project. And the picture on the left is the caption. This is when the library was first built, and the caption says, Sprague Library in 1965, before the cliff was removed. So as I mentioned, there were quarries all along the top of the mountain, including in the area that is now the northern reaches of Montclair State. So there was a quarry. Here's a cliff that was ultimately removed, because you can see in the picture that I just took a couple of weeks ago, there's no cliff there, and in fact the campus extends. But when the quarry went out of business, that quarry was the Houdet quarry. But when it went out of business, 7.5 acres were added to the campus, and the campus has just filled up every inch of it. So as I wrap up, I just wanted to take a big picture view at a couple of maps. On the left is our earliest digitized map of 1865. And I don't expect you to be able to see a lot, but just recognize this is the town line between Montclair and Cedar Grove. So here's Montclair, here's Cedar Grove. Here's that line between Montclair and Clifton. And there's names, there's property owners, but there's only a few buildings. There's little buildings. You don't see a lot of streets. You certainly don't see the railroad. There's not a lot going on. By 1906, you start, here's that pinch where Upper Mountain and at Laurel Place and the train are, you start to see more houses, you see the roads, you see some advancements. And then fast forward and compare the 1906 to the 1933, and you can see that level of development is pretty much what we have today, like lots of homes, the roads, well-established roads. And this is very similar to what we would have today, what we enjoy today. And that's the story of Montclair Heights as far as I know it, Jane. Well, back to you.
Helen, that was great as always. I've enjoyed it even the third time around. I thank you for being willing to do it a third time, and I hope everybody enjoys it as much as we do. We have lots of other programs on YouTube. Some are specific to areas of Montclair. Some are all over the place in terms of topics. So check them all out, and thank you. Hope to see you soon in person. Take care, Helen. Good night.
Yeah. Okay. Good night.